You may be seated. This morning we're getting towards the end of our study of the book of Titus. We're going to be in Titus for several more weeks, 3 more Sundays if you count today. But what we're going to talk about today is super important because it is going to determine whether we get to our destination or not. So the first step in getting towards your destination is usually it's the most critical step. It's going to determine your trajectory and whether you actually are going to get to where you hope to get. So if you have a destination in mind and it's over here, but your first step is in this direction, you're not going to get there. And it's the same way for us as we think about our destination in the book of Titus. God's vision for us as people who are living among Cretans, living among people who don't acknowledge God, who live in ways that are opposed to God, God's vision for us is that we would be beautiful people, a beautiful church, formed by our origin story, the beautiful gospel that Jesus gave himself for us to redeem us from wickedness. And so that beautiful gospel is meant to form beautiful people who do beautiful works in the world, a beautiful church. That's the destination that we have in mind, and the first step we take towards that destination is critical because it's going to determine whether we get toward that destination of a beautiful church or we don't. And you might be surprised to see what the first step is in the book of Titus. One of the reasons why I felt that it was important for us to begin our study at the end of Titus and work our way towards the beginning so that we could see how critical the first step toward becoming a beautiful church is. And we're going to see that first step in Titus chapter 1. So if you'll open your Bibles to Titus 1, we're going to read about the first step towards the destination of becoming a beautiful church. I want you to see if you can identify the first step. It's pretty easy in this passage to see what the first step towards becoming a beautiful church is. Titus chapter 1, beginning in verse 5. This is Paul explaining to Titus what he's left him in Crete all by himself to do. Right? How'd you like to be abandoned on the island of Crete? It's even tougher if you have the job description that is given to Titus here. So Paul says this: the reason I left you in Crete was that you might put in order what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. An elder must be blameless, faithful to his wife, a man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. Since an overseer manages God's household, he must be blameless, not overbearing, not quick-tempered, not given to drunkenness, not violent, not pursuing dishonest gain. Rather, he must be hospitable, one who loves what is good, who is self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firmly to the trustworthy message as it has been taught, so that he can encourage others by sound doctrine and refute those who oppose it. Paul is going to describe a beautiful destination for the church, a beautiful church formed by a beautiful gospel, beautiful people who live beautiful lives and do beautiful works in the world. That's the destination. But Paul knows there's one first critical step in arriving at that destination. He knows that a beautiful church depends on beautiful leaders. And that's the very first assignment that he gives Titus on the island of Crete, to appoint beautiful leaders to lead in the church. That's what we're going to be talking about this morning and next week, the importance of beautiful leaders in the body. If we want to arrive at that destination, beautiful leaders. Now, you'll notice that this is his first step. Titus is to put in order what was left unfinished. That's that word we talked about with the root ortho to it, like an orthodontist, to straighten it out, straighten teeth out, put it in order, straighten this out, And in the process of straightening out what's left unfinished, here's what I want you to do. I want you to appoint elders in every church as I directed you, and here's what an elder ought to look like. So we're talking here, directly, this passage is talking about elders. That's the term that is used in the New Testament for those official, responsible, and accountable leaders in the church. The responsible, accountable leaders, men in the body who are responsible for the health and well-being of the whole church. That's what that word elder means. And there's a synonym for the word elder in verse 7, where he says, an overseer. Since an overseer, that's the second word in the New Testament used for this role of leadership and authority in the body. Elder, overseer, pretty much synonymous, and then the third term is the term pastor. And so Paul is talking about those who are the official responsible leaders in the church. In our case, elders and pastors, particularly. And so, for you this morning, you're thinking, how does this apply to me? So, couple different thoughts. First of all, some of you are preparing for a role of vocational ministry. Some of you, that's your aspiration. I want to serve in the church as a pastor, or some kind of capacity like that. Well, then there's a one-to-one correspondence between everything we say this morning, everything we read in this passage, and you and your life plans. Second, there are those of you who aspire to leadership, spiritual leadership in the church. Some of you aspire to someday serve as an elder. Some of you aspire, maybe you're a woman and you're not aspiring to serve as an elder, but you're aspiring to serve in a role of spiritual influence. Aspiring to spiritual leadership is a good thing, Paul tells us, 1 Timothy 3:1. It's a good thing, but it comes with some qualifications and considerations. So if you aspire to just be a person of influence in your church and to be able to lead or to teach in some capacity, then this passage is for you. And the rest of you think you're getting off easy because, well, okay, I don't aspire to lead anybody, really. You know, I just show up. Well, here's news for you. You may not think of yourself as a leader. You just show up and you you don't have any aspirations to lead anybody. You may not think of yourself as a leader, but you want to know the truth? Your church does. We do think of you as leaders. I think of everyone who attends Trinity Bible Church as a leader. And a leader who probably has even more potential to lead. Because what is a leader but someone with a vision for something that ought to be better and a willingness to take initiative and do something about it and bring other people with them? That's what a leader is. And I think that God has put, now maybe you're not an organizational leader. That may be helpful to you to distinguish between being an organizational leader and just being a person who influences other people for good. One of our visions as a church, this is pretty much our vision as a church. As we're clarifying who we are as the church in Richardson, in North Dallas, one of the things that the elders and I have been clarifying is, you know what our vision really is for the people of this body? Our vision as a church is to be a church that creates wholehearted followers and leaders out of the same people. Not followers and then some leaders, but really to create a church family where we are all growing as followers of Jesus and leaders of others. God's put in each of us a desire to make things better. He's put in each of us the ability to take initiative and to influence other people in that direction. And so when we're talking about what it means to be a leader, a spiritual leader, we want it to be equipping to everyone here. Leadership, vital to the health of the church. Maybe I hear different things than you hear because I have a different responsibility in the church. But one of the things that I hear going around church world, not Trinity Bible Church, but church world, is kind of a distancing right now from the subject of leadership in the church. There was a time in the 1990s and the 2000s, leadership was a big thing, and I think essential. But in the last few years, you've had some people kind of distancing themselves from talking about leadership in a church context. One of the reasons for that, I think, is because in some of the contexts where leadership was taught and exemplified, it kind of blew up and looks pretty bad now. Maybe that's something you're not aware of, but distancing ourselves from, we cannot separate a healthy church from having healthy leaders. God uses men and women and their model and example and initiative to create health in whatever He is doing. You read it in the Old Testament, you certainly read it in the New Testament, you're absolutely reading it here, inescapable, that leaders are essential to a healthy church. And if you want a beautiful church, you must have beautiful leaders. And that's the charge that Paul gives Timothy. He says, I want you to appoint leaders in the body, elders, men of spiritual authority and responsibility and accountability, and I want them to be beautiful. So he not only tells them to appoint elders, he says, this is what they ought to look like. And this morning, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about this is the fact that the beautiful church needs beautiful leaders. And a beautiful leader is this. A beautiful leader is a beautiful follower. A beautiful follower who excels in life and doctrine. That's our description of a beautiful leader from this passage. A beautiful leader is a beautiful follower who excels in life and doctrine. We're going to cover part of that today and the rest of that next week. But the very first part of that statement is a beautiful leader is first and foremost a beautiful follower. As obvious as that sounds, you'd be surprised at how churches kind of skip that first step. They skip that first step, and they think, who do we need? I can't tell you how many meetings I've sat in like this, so I've sat in a bunch. And people say, well, what do we need? We need someone who's good at this and this and this. Well, how about so-and-so? They do that for their living. Let's ask them to do it, and they never give a thought to, is this person a beautiful follower? Are they wholehearted as a follower of Jesus, or are we going to put them in a position of responsibility and authority and not expect that they are also beautiful followers? Now, remember that everything I'm saying is not just speaking of elders. It's speaking of all kinds of leadership roles in the church. And we sometimes skip the step that leadership roles, positions of authority and responsibility in the body, they ought to be filled by, first and foremost, a beautiful follower. You see, because these traits that are described in Titus chapter 1, in 1 Timothy chapter 3, these qualifications of spiritual leaders, they are not unique to spiritual leaders. They are expected of spiritual leaders, but they're the norm for every follower of Jesus. These criterion it's not a higher bar for leaders. It is a higher bar for leaders, but the bar is, first and foremost, are you a wholehearted follower? These traits are not unique to leaders. Take one, for example. One of the qualifications of a leader in verse 8 is he must be self-controlled. How many times have we already talked about self-control as part of being a beautiful church? You remember it came up in the second half of Titus 2 where Paul says, hey, the grace of God teaches all of us to say no to worldly passions and ungodliness and to live self-controlled lives. Expected of all of us, self-control. Self-control is expected of all of us. Then we saw it's expected of the older men in the church, Titus chapter 2, verse 1. It's specifically addressed for younger women in the church, the young men in the church. Self-control, it's the same quality. These are not unique to just leaders. It's not a special group of qualifications. It's being a wholehearted follower that first qualifies you to be a spiritual leader. Self-control is one example. Another trait in this passage is not given to drunkenness. Well, we've already seen that one of older men and older women, not given to drunkenness. These are not unique to leaders. These are just the expectations of every follower of Jesus, but they certainly ought to be true of those who aspire to leadership. So as a church, we have to be careful that when we fill roles of responsibility, we're first of all looking at, hey, does this person follow Jesus in a way that we want multiplied throughout our church? And then for you as an aspiring spiritual leader, the question is this, or the point is this, really. If you aspire to be a spiritual leader, you aspire to spiritual leadership, the first step towards spiritual leadership is your own discipleship. I know that there are men and women here who aspire to lead. You aspire to more. You want to use your gifts. You want to serve in the body. You want a role that has meaning to it. Your first step towards qualifying to do that is your own discipleship. So you being a wholehearted follower is the first thing you got to work on. It's so easy for us to get our eyes out ahead of the things we want to do and fail to look at our own lives and ask, if the whole church were to be reproduced like me, what would that look like? So, the first step of a beautiful leader is simply that they are first and foremost a beautiful follower. We cannot skip that step. It must be stated. If you aspire to spiritual leadership, your first step is your own serious discipleship. A beautiful leader is a beautiful follower who excels. That's the second part of this definition. A beautiful follower who excels. And the key word here in our passage is the word blameless. Verse 6, an elder must be blameless. And then look at verse 7. An overseer manages God's household. He must be blameless. 2 times in this passage, blameless. A leader, someone who aspires to spiritual authority in the body and responsibility and accountability must first and foremost be blameless. Now, that at first sounds like a high standard, blameless. But here's the ironic thing. I've seen it used as a very low standard. Again, I've sat in on a bunch of meetings since 1989 in churches trying to determine, hey, who would be right to fill this role of spiritual leadership, whether it's a staff person or an elder or a deacon. And early on in my ministry, I would hear discussions like this. It says that they should be blameless, and it says here, they'd all open their Bibles and they'd get out this passage and they'd say, elder must be blameless, faithful to his wife. Okay, I don't think this person has ever had an affair. All right, okay, never had an affair, and I've never seen them, I don't think they get drunk. And somehow not having an affair and not getting drunk qualifies you to be a spiritual leader in the church. When these people who were being discussed, they'd never had an affair, and they didn't even drink maybe. But you know what? There was something wrong with them. They weren't the kind of person who would compel you to respect them. They didn't live in a way that had any kind of draw to their lives. It's just that they didn't have anything wrong with them. And the point of this word blameless is, and so I would leave these meetings scratching my head saying, something just went wrong. I can't figure out what it was, because we did have the qualifications of an elder out in front of us, but I don't think we used it right. It took me a while to realize that when you're looking for someone who's blameless, you're not looking for someone with nothing wrong with them. You are looking for someone with something right with them. You are not looking for someone who doesn't have any overt disqualification. You are looking for men, women who are excelling in these qualities. They excel. Our passage doesn't just have negative qualities, don't do this or that, but also positive qualities. They must manifest these qualities. These ought to be strengths. So I think the way to get this right back on track is to understand that spiritual leaders ought to be people who excel. It's not that there's nothing wrong with them. It's that there are things that are right about them that compel us to pay attention to their lives, to respect their words, to allow them to have influence in our lives, because not just there's nothing wrong with them, but there are qualities that are right with them that we recognize are God's influence in our own, that God wants to influence us in our own lives. It's a same word, turn it around and look at it differently, and I think it changes what we expect of spiritual leaders. It also changes those of us who aspire to spiritual leadership. It also changes how we think about it. We're not just trying to meet the minimum bar, but God has called us to excel and model in qualities that allow and earn the respect of people and allow them to allow influence from leaders into their lives. So a beautiful leader is a beautiful follower who excels in life and doctrine. Now, life and doctrine, I like that phrase because it describes this passage, but it also comes from something that Paul tells Timothy in Timothy chapter 4 when he tells Timothy, who is a pastor, he says, Timothy, watch your life and doctrine closely. Watch your life and doctrine. Now, the elders have heard me say this a bunch. We talk about this a bunch as elders. We say, hey, listen, we got to watch our life and our doctrine closely. We got to watch our life as closely as we watch our doctrine. So that label, life and doctrine, is kind of inspired by 1 Timothy 4, chapter 4:16, watch your life and doctrine closely. But it unfolds this passage beautifully. Because in verses 6 through 8, you have life. All these qualities, personal qualities. We'll look at one this week and the rest next week. And then in verse 9, what do you have? What do you have in verse 9? Go ahead and say it out loud. Okay, I'm going to cue you on this, and we're just going to do it, okay? We said the label is life and doctrine, and through verse 8 we have life, which means that in verse 9 we have doctrine, right? And we do have doctrine. That's exactly what it says. They must hold firmly to the trustworthy message as has been taught, so we can encourage others by sound doctrine, refute those opposed it. So I want you to know, this idea of life and doctrine, it's right here in this passage. That a beautiful leader is a beautiful follower who excels in life and doctrine. We're going to look at part of life today, the rest of life, and then doctrine next week. Because the first thing that Paul mentions about a leader's life is worth taking some time to fully understand and to get our hearts around. The very first thing he says about a leader watching his life is, verse 6, an elder must be blameless, faithful to his wife, a man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. The very first thing Paul mentions about a leader is their current, or a potential leader, is their current stewardship. How they are stewarding the responsibility they have right now. And in this case, it's the family. That the very first life quality for anyone who wants to have influence and authority in the body is, in particular for elders, how they are managing their families. And remember, we're not looking for the absence of wrong, we're looking for the presence of right here. It's interesting because a leader's ability to, there is a pretty direct correspondence between how a person, we're going to talk about elders now particularly, so we'll talk about men, all right? There's a direct correspondence, pretty direct correspondence between how a man leads his family and how he will lead in the church. How a man relates to his wife and his children and how he will function as a leader in the body. And Paul says, hey, listen, look at verse 7. He says, since an overseer manages God's household, he must be blameless. There's an overlap between God's household and your household, dads. And your household is one of the ways that you demonstrate your ability or inability to lead in the church, because our families are our first ministry obligation. Our families are our first ministry obligation. And so Paul says here, listen, you got to look for guys, because this is how it's going to affect the beauty of the body. So you got to look for guys who are, first of all, faithful to their wives, faithful to his wife. I think that's a pretty accurate description of what's being asked for here. That we can debate a lot of different parts of this passage. But I think if we really want to understand its essence, we're looking for someone who is faithful to their wives. Now remember, that doesn't mean they've never had an affair. There's nothing wrong with them. The question is there something right with them in the way they relate to their wife? Do they love their wife? Not just have they never crossed the line of having an affair, but are they loyal to their wife in heart and in mind? And do they treat their wife like Jesus treats the church? Do they love their wife like Christ loved the church? You say, wait a minute, you're adding to the qualifications of being an elder here. No, I'm not. I'm just reminding you that every elder is supposed to be a wholehearted follower, and every wholehearted following man is supposed to love his wife like Christ loved the church. So, faithful to his wife, demonstrated kindness and love. And does that man have the respect of his wife? Has he, over the 20 years they've been married, earned his wife's respect? Those are the things that Paul says, Titus, you pay attention. You look for someone who's faithful to his wife. Not only faithful to his wife, but also faithful to his children. Whose children, it says here, whose children are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. So, we're remembering that how a man leads his family will determine, in large part, how he's able to lead his church, the people in the body. And the idea here is that, hey, someone who has children who are wild and disobedient, you might want to pay attention to that. Now, here's what I don't think Paul is saying: every elder has to be married, has to have a wife, or has to have children. If they don't, then you're going to have to look for some other important area of demonstrated competence in their areas of stewardship. I don't think it requires that, but I think it's a great laboratory for growing leaders. And Paul says, listen, you want to look for someone whose children aren't open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. Now, there's a little bit of difference between Paul and Titus's day, when there were whole households, and when you were the paterfamilias, things went your way, right? Versus the way our culture works, it's a little bit different. So some of those things, but the idea of a father being a father with some demonstrated success in the raising of his family, that's what Titus is intended to look for here. And so you're a little bit challenged to think, so that means my kid's got to turn out perfect, right? So the quick answer to that is no, thankfully. Isn't it funny? Here's the point. God is also a parent. How are God's children doing? Are all God's children obedient, or are some of them open to the charge of being wild and reckless? Hey, but God is a parent. He's a parent. So children are people. You can't control people. Just like God has given us. We're people. We're people in the world. He wants to be our parent. But He lets us make choices that take us closer or farther away. And so I don't think that as much emphasis is always, that we should put as much emphasis always on the outcome, because people are people. And I think instead we should put the emphasis on the input and the response. I'll explain that in a minute. We all know moms and dads who've done a great job. I do. Moms and dads who've done a great job with their kids. I mean, great. Sometimes in ways, I'm thinking of people who've raised their kids in ways that I wish I was more like them. And their children they're pretty open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. They haven't turned out in the way that you would thought those great parents would have experienced. On the other hand, I'll bet we also can think of some pretty stellar people, and we're like, how did you ever make it coming out of that family? Right? So, we recognize by God's grace that certain things happen, and by God's allowance, other things happen. We can't control people. How should we think of this passage? I think the way to think about this is that what we can control as moms and dads, not the outcome, but we can control the input and we can control our response. So we can control the input. The question for a dad would be, is this dad an intentional discipler of his children? Is he intentional with his children? Is he engaged with his children? Is he relational with his children? Does he endeavor to disciple his children? Are his children and his responsibility to them a priority to him? That's the input. And then you can also measure the response. How does that father respond when things don't go, when kids don't respond like he wants them to? How does he deal with those relational dynamics in the family that are going to reproduce themselves in the church with people? Is he harsh with his children? Does he cut them off? Does he roll over and let them do whatever they want to do if they defy him? How a dad deals with his family and his children and responds to them is, there's going to be a lot of correspondence between how that dad engages as an elder in a body. So we control input, we control response. Is that father quick-tempered? These qualities towards the end of the passage. Not violent, not quick-tempered, not overbearing. Are those qualities that show up in his fathering? They should be qualities. I mean, the correct form of those, not overbearing, not quick-tempered. That should be evident in his fathering. But we can't control the response. I told you a couple of weeks ago I was reading a book by Dallas Willard. So Dallas Willard, if you don't know who he is, he's just he's passed away maybe 10 years ago, but he was a meaningful thinker and influencer in the church in terms of how God grows Christ-likeness in people and the spiritual disciplines and practices and all that stuff. It's Dallas Willard. Super helpful. So he's a really smart guy. Taught philosophy at USC. And so he's pretty smart, and he's a wholehearted Jesus follower. And he has a son named John. And John is still alive, I think. So I don't want to say anything bad about John today. But he and his son John, they kind of went like this. So Dallas Willard is raising his son John in Southern California in the 1960s. And here's this kid in the 1960s, Southern California, and his dad takes him for a haircut. Every time he gets a haircut, he gets a buzz cut. All right, this is California, Southern California, 1960s. You may not be able to relate. I can relate because when I was a kid growing up, I got the shortest haircuts. You know, I mean, they were what you called white walls back then. I don't know if they call them that anymore. I got white walls, and it was short on the neck, and I got to comb it over a little bit, but I always felt like I stuck out because all my friends, they had hair, kind of went to their ears or over their ear, whatever. And that was cool, and I looked awful. And that's how John felt about himself, only he got even a worse haircut. He got a total crew cut every time. I don't mean bald, but I mean it was standing up straight. And when it started to fold over, Dallas would say, John, it's time for you to get a haircut. And he would go kicking and screaming to the barber and get his haircut. He hated it. So finally, when John turned 13, Dallas said to his son, he said, hey, you're 13 years old now. You are old enough to decide when to get your haircut. I'm going to let you decide when to get your haircut, and you're going to be in charge of that decision. He was 13. He did not cut his hair again until he was 21. He had a big ponytail by then, of course. And Dallas Willard, hey, he couldn't control his son, but he could control the input. He could control his response. And man, I tell you what, that is a lot like pastoring. Okay, now you're in charge of making this decision, and then sometimes you see people make a decision, you're like, I thought we just talked about that, And so our families. Now, this is also true. I know I'm talking about men and elders, but remember, we've already talked about the fact that you moms, young moms with children in your home, that's your good works for you. And that is also true for you, how you raise your children, rear your children, model for your children. You control the inputs and the responses. And for anyone, so here's the temptation for some who are like really hard-charging leaders. You will see your family as an obstacle to all the great things God wants to use you to do. And you need to understand your family is not an obstacle. Your wife is not an obstacle. Your children are not an obstacle. They are the laboratory in which God is going to qualify you and cultivate you to be able to lead other people. So, don't get caught up on, I think my family's getting in the way of all the amazing things God's equipped you to do. No, right there at your house is the place where you qualify yourself as a spiritual leader. Now, maybe you don't have children. Maybe you're not married, and you're like, well, how do I qualify myself as a spiritual leader? That's where we back up a little bit from this passage. We get a little more altitude, and we say, hey, you know what? Maybe you don't have a family. Maybe you don't have a spouse. All right? But you have certain things that God has put in your trust. Maybe you have parents. Maybe you have other people in your life. Maybe you have just an area of responsibility that God has entrusted to you. The point is that that's where we start. The place to begin cultivating spiritual leadership is right where we are at. Whatever stewardship God has given you, that's where you're going to qualify yourself as a spiritual leader. So whatever your current assignment is, whatever it is, you do it with diligence, and that's how God prepares you for whatever else He wants you. So you just do what's right in front of you with a whole heart and let God do whatever He wants to do with that. So really, with all that, a beautiful leader is a beautiful follower who excels in life. And we've really just kind of done point A in life. We'll get the rest of it next week. We're really, just in this part of our study, we've already come full circle. Because we said last week that the good works God wants you to do are the good works that are closest to you, right there in front of you. And so we're back at that same idea today, that even if you want to grow as a spiritual leader, you want to have spiritual authority and help people and have influence and use your gifts and teach or encourage and shepherd, where do you start? You start right where you're at, with being a wholehearted follower of Jesus, making that your life priority, making that your measure. You start by just being a wholehearted follower of Jesus. Then you grow to excel in areas that God has called you to excel in as a Jesus follower, and you take your current stewardship, your family, if you have one, your other responsibilities that God may have entrusted to you as you have them, and you focus on doing those well. And that's how God qualifies us for whatever He wants to do next. My hope is that you find this challenging and encouraging, that it helps you think about your own life. And I hope it lights a fire under everybody here, even if you didn't walk in thinking of yourself as a leader, that it lights a fire under you to say, yeah, I want to be a wholehearted follower. I want to do a good job with whatever God's entrusted to me. And who knows, maybe He might use me for something more. So, to summarize, if you want to have a beautiful church, you got to pick beautiful leaders. If you want to be a beautiful leader, you got to practice having a beautiful life. Let's close with prayer. Let's ask God to carry this work out in us. Let's ask God to help us be the church that we envision, that we believe He's entrusting us to be, a church that cultivates followers and leaders. Let me ask you before I pray, is there something this morning that you could take with you, an idea, an encouragement that you would be remiss if you didn't remember it? And you really want to take it out of this room with you, what would that be? Father, you've done beautiful things for us. You are beautiful, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, just like we want to be as leaders and parents and spouses, just like you. You're beautiful, and you've done something beautiful for us. Jesus, you gave yourself for us to redeem us from wickedness and purify us to belong to you and to be eager to do good things in the world, like aspire to responsibility and accountability and helping others. I pray that you will help us as we want to be beautiful people. And we want to follow Jesus wholeheartedly. We want to manage the responsibilities you've given us and to be eager to do what is good with the good that's right in front of us. And as you do that, as you help us accomplish that, Father, I pray that you will show us increasing areas of influence and stewardship that you might want to entrust us with. I pray that you will continue to raise up beautiful leaders in our church, beautiful men and women of influence, whose wholehearted love for you is contagious and infectious and equipping. And that all of this would reflect you well to each other and to the community where you've placed us. This is a work that only you can do, and we ask that you would carry it out in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. One thing I should let you know is that you have some beautiful elders. I don't know how often you think about that, but you have some beautiful elders. Randy Lawson here this morning. Give him an elbow for us, Tama. We're going to clap, but you've got to elbow him, Tama. You've got to give him that and keep him humble. Thank you. Murillo, who had to leave this morning but was here, had to leave, and Mike Buer, who's on the road. You could pray for him as he's in travel. We have some beautiful leaders. We're thankful for that. That's a sign of God's grace to us. I got one reminder for you. Don't fall down the stairs. My reminder for you is to be a gospel extrovert. That's our other vision for the people of this church. Create wholehearted followers, wholehearted leaders, and gospel extroverts. Not an extrovert in every area of your life, but for the gospel, okay? So, gospel extroverts take signs and put them in their yard. That's what gospel extroverts do. So they're all over the building. We've done as much thought as we can to how to keep these in front of you. Bring a sign, Easter Sunday, 4 Sundays from today. So a great opportunity to invite our friends, opportunity for us to further what God is doing in us, in the lives of other people. Why wouldn't we want to do that, right? So pick up one of those. And if you'll stand, I'd like to dismiss us all in the benediction from Hebrews 13. Then remember to show some love to the people that God's put around you this morning. Now may the God of peace, who through the blood of the eternal covenant brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus, that great shepherd of the sheep, may he equip you with everything good for doing his will and work in us what is pleasing to him. Through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen.